Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Illiteracy Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Benson, a senior policy analyst at the Heartland Institute, a national free market think tank. We are in the episode 170 something range of the podcast, maybe even 180. Never really sure what the episode number is. But so we've been around for a while now. But for those of you just tuning in for the first time, basically what we do here on the podcast is I invite an author on to discuss a book of theirs that's been newly published or recently published on someone or some idea, some event, something, et cetera, that we think you guys would like to hear a conversation about. And then hopefully at the end of the podcast, you go ahead and give the book a purchase and give it a read. So if you like this podcast, please consider giving Illiteracy a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this show, and also by sharing with your friends, as that's the best way to support programming like this. And my guest today is Dr. Frank Trentmann, and Dr. Trentmann is the professor of history at Birkbeck College, the University of London, and also an associate at the Center for Consumer Society Research in Helsinki. You may have seen his work in Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, Time Magazine, The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books, The Times Literary Supplement, Literary Review, Tablet, The Financial Times, The New Republic, and The Guardian, among many, many others. And he is the author of Empire of Things, How We Became a World of Consumers from the 15th Century to the 21st, Free Trade Nation, Commerce, Consumption, and Civil Society in Modern Britain, and lastly, Out of the Darkness, The Germans, 1942 to 2022, which was published last February by Knopf or Knopf, never sure. I've heard it pronounced both ways, so I'm never sure which one it is, but so I'll do both. Anyway, and that is the book we will be discussing today. So, Dr. Trentmann, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I do appreciate it.
Yeah, very good to talk to you.
Oh, thank you. So, normal entry question for everybody that comes on the podcast, and that's what made you want to write this book? What was the genesis of the project? I mean, you're primarily a historian of consumer issues, no? So, how did you decide to take on this much broader subject?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I did, as you mentioned, I had finished, or I was in the final stages of finishing the book Empire of Things, which looks at our changing relationship to possessions and how consumption became so important to us, really over 500 years. And one thing that's a kind of red thread running through that book is morality and the ways in which people's shopping and spending and buying or not buying has always been moralized. So are you a good person if you buy certain goods, or should you boycott them? What does it do to you to lust after lots of things? So these were very big ethical concerns that divided and polarized societies, and it only softened that morality in the 19th and 20th century, and people became a little bit used to being consumers. So I'd been working on that, and we are in sort of at the end of 2015, and that was the time when the so-called refugee crisis happened in Syria and in Europe. And Chancellor Angela Merkel is in power and decides that Germany would welcome what turned out to be, in that year, almost 1 million refugees. So huge debate ever since, really. And reading the German newspapers, and working in London and looking at the British and American and other European press, I suddenly noticed how the topic of how Germany should respond to this challenge was sort of heavily cast in a moral frame. So it was partly about the refugees, but it was also about, are we good people? Have we become good people? Have we overcome finally the sort of guilt and sins of our fathers? And this kind of moral discussion didn't really take place in any other European country. So I sort of took a note of that, and then I started observing how many other topics in German society were also heavily moralized. So, do you recycle? Do you sort your recycling? That was an indication not just whether you're helping the environment, but whether you're a virtuous person or not. Are you looking after your aging parents or putting them in a care home? Who looks after the children? Those do you save? Are you a thrifty person? Or are you an American style consumer? So all of these things had these moral overtones. So I thought, hey, I'm a historian. These are important questions. Where does this come from? How did this develop? And so I then started this book project, and it led me back to the Second World War.
Mm-hmm. As a historian of consumerism, do you know what the morality is of buying thousands and thousands of books, just off the top of your head?
Yeah, no, well, the interesting thing is, no. I mean, the interesting thing about this is that
asking for a friend, by the way. Yeah.
People moralize certain aspects of consumption. There's always how other people consume. That's a moral dilemma. So the question you said, I mean, I had a very senior historian, very eminent historian, who reviewed my book, gave it a very positive review, and I ran into him at some point, and he said, "Wow, but aren't you exaggerating? I'm not a big consumer." And I said, "Look, how many books do you have? 3,000, 4,000?" He said, "Yeah, but that's books. That's not consumption." So it continues to be.
It's a debilitating habit, is what it is.
Other people's style of consuming that gets negative verdicts.
Yeah, right. All right. Well, moving on. So basically, in the book, so what it means to be German after Hitler and after the Third Reich and the Holocaust is an unavoidable question. But over the last 80 years, Germany has gone through a very remarkable moral and material regeneration from the end of the war. So how do the Germans see themselves today? And does that view match reality?
Well, that's the core questions which I'm trying to get at in the book. And at the same time as I chart this ever more intense sort of moral reorientation and repositioning as being good people, I point out that in reality, a lot of problems are outsourced or swept under the carpet. So you have a fair bit of hypocrisy trying to maintain this moral standard. And you can see this all the way to the present. So the book, for listeners, the book goes up to the beginning of the Russian attack on Ukraine in 2022. And it came out in winter 2023 24. So a fair bit has happened in these last 2.5 years, but the moral or the divide and the ambivalence continues all the way to the present. So if you just take Germany's position in Europe, the population is deeply divided over fundamental questions. So some think that sending weapons to Ukraine is the right moral lesson to draw from the German past. Others see it exactly the opposite. And you have similar debates about Israel, about migration, and so forth. So Germany is really in a tight spot. mainly has put itself in this tight spot where it has created certain expectations of what Germany should be like, both in terms of material comfort, but also moral position in the world, and it finds it ever more difficult to reconcile these. And I think, I mean, that's sort of my personal view. I think this will get harder now because Germany is being pulled into assuming greater responsibility in Europe, financially, but also militarily. And it's been a bit a country in denial. You didn't need to. You could be moral because you never had to take much responsibility.
Right.
I mean, militarily, Germany relied entirely on NATO and particularly on the United States. Environmentally, Germany tried to be a sort of crusader for environmentalism, but ultimately kept its coal industry going, shut down nuclear, but you keep coal going. So there are all sorts of compromises that have been made. One should perhaps point out, I mean, because it's a history book, so I don't just look at the present. I try to put the present in this longer perspective. It is quite remarkable how much has changed in Germany. So if you take just the military side, these days people look at Germany as this country doesn't have an army, doesn't spend much for national security. It got sort of this idea that there would always be peace. In the early 1970s, under Chancellor Willy Brandt, Social Democrat, Germany spent 3.5% of its GDP on the army. So the majority of Germans went and did their military service in the army. You had compulsory military service. So the way Germany is now, Germany wasn't in the 70s or 60s. So we're dealing with change over time.
Right. Before we get into all that stuff, I guess. So let me just ask you. So, sort of explain to everybody what what was the purpose of starting the narrative in 1942 instead of 1939 or 1933 or even say 1945. Why specifically the year 1942?
Yeah. So I start in the winter of 42-43. And the main reason for that is that there are three big developments coming together. I mean, the Holocaust is now underway. And on top of that, you get in February 1943 the final defeat of the German army at Stalingrad. So the Eastern Front is now in crisis. And then on top of that, you have increasingly relentless aerial bombing. So that gathers speed as well. So you have three things coming together. And as they're coming together, more and more Germans are trying to make sense of a situation that now looks to them ever more uncertain. So the war isn't lost at this point, but there's the possibility it might be lost. And that really shakes people up, and they start to ask themselves questions which they didn't or hadn't in the first half of the Second World War. And so it's partly if you want, a literary device. So I can use that period to open up to readers, how did people on the ground experience this growing pressure cooker? How did they try to make sense of it? What sort of answers did they reach? So it's partly that, but it's also that this period shows how some people, not all people, but some people started to reposition themselves. So they started to ask themselves basic questions, such as, why are we being bombed? There must be a reason for that. And so some people's answer is, well, this is probably payback now for how we treated the Jews. We went too far, and we should reconsider perhaps our attitude to the Nazi regime in response of that. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people for whom this growing pressure is confirmation that everything Hitler and Goebbels have been saying is absolutely right. So they're seeing the bombing as evidence that the Americans and Jews are trying to annihilate the German nation. So the response they take from this is not a retreat from Nazi ideas, but to call for ever more relentless acts of extermination. So you can use this period to sort of see how a whole population is in flux, trying to make sense of these changes. I mean, that may sound a little bit abstract to some listeners. So let me give you just one example of a school teacher from northern Germany who was a fervent supporter of the war effort in the first half of the Second World War. So he thinks Hitler's a genius, the greatest military leader of all time. He volunteers to write secret intelligence reports on people in his school and in his small town for the Nazi regime. His son then joins the army and is moved to the Eastern Front. And so in December, they still have some letters from him, and they then sort of dry up, and they know he's sort of near Stalingrad. And so he listens to the news on radio, in which sort of slowly becomes clear this is a real catastrophe happening there in Stalingrad. And he and his wife start to worry. He keeps a diary. And you suddenly have in sort of January, February 43, that same man who was absolutely convinced of Hitler and the German war effort asking questions such as, I'm no longer sure who the worst criminal on earth is. Is it really Stalin or perhaps Hitler? He's sort of angry as Goebbels rails against the enemy and Jews. He says, this is really bad because he puts our boys who might be prisoners of war in real danger. He then decides he's no longer going to hoist the swastika, the Nazi flag, out of his balcony. He also takes off the party badge. And he stops writing. He says, I'm not going to write any more intelligence reports for the regime. The flag is only going to go up when my son comes home, which doesn't happen. So in this period, this same man kind of repositions himself towards the regime and towards his own past. So when the war comes to an end, this man has already persuaded himself that he was never really supporting the war effort. He always had suspicions about Hitler and so forth. And so these kind of stories are very important if we want to understand how a society where the majority of Germans had supported Hitler and his regime in 1939, how that same society managed to undergo reconstruction. So we don't have, and that's why we need to start in the middle of the war, because there is no such thing as the so-called hour zero. So 1945 is not a clean break where suddenly all the Nazis have to be converted or reinvent themselves. You have already cracks appearing in the Nazi community before the end of the war. So this uncertainty and the ambivalence and the sort of people rewriting effectively their own biography and their own memories is very important.
And I think you said in the book, was it something like was it half of all the total German battlefield casualties in the war ended up taking place in the final 10 months? Is that right?
It's absolutely the final stages. I mean, the last year particularly is absolutely brutal, and it has repercussions. So for some people fighting, it actually is a hardening experience. They've been fighting. They've been fighting so long. That's all they know, and they know that if Germany loses, they're probably going to be. They might be put on trial or be in difficulties. So they just toughen up and they keep going. Others start slipping away. So the number of deserters really shoots up in the very final stages. It's a very brutal time of history.
Yeah. We could talk a lot more about the war itself, but I want to, but you can just get bogged down in all the World War II stuff. So I want to move forward a bit. So there's this idea that the Germans, quote unquote, retreated into silence after the war. Is that necessarily true? And you write in the book that the dominant language of moral renewal after the war was cast in individual and spiritual terms, not in political terms, and it was mainly addressed to the Germans themselves and not their victims. So could you talk a little about that for a second?
Yeah. So the common, so the widely held view of the immediate post-war years is that Germans suppressed their responsibility and their guilt. So they shut up and they went into silence. And foreign visitors and observers like Hannah Arendt note that in 1948-49. They say they don't want to talk about it. But that's actually a misconception. And the evidence is actually pointing more in the opposite direction. So the Germans, including prisoners of war and their families, they talk about the war. They don't see this as a problem. They don't work with assumptions of human rights. So they even mention what we would now consider war crimes when talking to each other. The difference is they don't talk much about the victims of Nazi violence. So they talk about themselves. And that takes a number of forms. So the initial form is actually you have lectures in autumn, winter 1945, where famous authors and so forth talk about guilt. And they leave no doubt that, they think the German nation is guilty. What then happens is if when they're trying to explain how could this land of poets and philosophers have ended up committing all these crimes, how do you explain that? They don't then revert to what we might call historical causes. So they don't look at political causes. That's when they revert to a sort of spiritual level, which is somehow in modern times people got alienated from their spiritual self, and their minds and actions were taken over. They were seduced by people like Hitler, a kind of demonic forces winning them over, and then like in witchcraft, they're sort of banned. So it's not that they pinpoint something particular in German history. It's more sort of the spiritual atmosphere of a modern world gone mad, where people have lost their mooring. They're just after money or power or military might. And the Germans were seduced by that, and that's the explanation. But there is still talk of guilt. That then changes in 1946 and after, during denazification, because denazification works on the premise that you have to fill in a form in which you openly state, joined the Nazi party in this year, was active in this capacity, and so forth. So the discussion of moral guilt is now really personal, because you can lose your job, or your home, or be fined, or classified as a Nazi, or complicit in crimes. So in denazification, people step back and they don't want to talk about guilt. And what now takes over is so the language of shame. Now, guilt is about something bad you do to another person. So it's still focused onto what you do to others.
Right.
Shame is about yourself. You feel ashamed how people look at you. So it's self-directed. So shame becomes a very important way of addressing something bad had happened, but ultimately becomes directed towards the German people themselves. And that then gathers speed in the late 40s and 1950s, because what we have to remember is you have in Germany, you have 12 million expellees. Those are the people,
massive number.
ethnic Germans driven out of Central and Eastern Europe. So they've lost their homeland, their houses, their jobs. You have those. Then you have the millions who've been bombed out of their homes. Then you have all the veterans and disabled people and so forth. So you have enormous numbers of people who didn't come out well out of the war, and they are now the main voice talking about victims. Basically they're competing with each other. Who can shout loudest? We're the victims. We deserve help. And in that chorus of voices, most of them German, the real victims, or the people we today consider as the real victims, Jews in the first place, but also political prisoners, other victims of the Nazis, for religious reasons or other orientations, they get marginalized. They get shouted out, basically. So this focus on their own victimhood is quite important, because it also ties in with reconstruction. You'd mentioned that we have, in this story, we have moral reconstruction is entwined with material reconstruction. And so these people are partly asking, look, I've been a victim. I deserve help with housing, or a job if you're an expellee, and so forth. So these two stories are very much entwined. One needs to perhaps add 2 points. One is, in West Germany, Adenauer, the first chancellor of the Federal Republic, he takes a big step towards reconciliation with Israel, and he signs by the standards of this times, of unprecedented reparations agreement with Israel and the Jewish Claims Conference. This was hugely unpopular. So it was his government, with the support, some members of his government boycotted this move. So he needed opposition party support to get it through parliament. The majority of the population think this is a really bad idea and excessive and not right. So one way West German society deals with the question of guilt and responsibility is you have a division of labor. The state takes over formally that responsibility, but by doing so, it also lets individual citizens off the hook. For most people, with Adenauer's policy, this matter is now off the table, so you don't any longer need to worry about it, and certainly you don't need to have introspection or ask yourself anymore about your own role. That's West Germany. The country is divided. You have a socialist East Germany, and there the discussion of guilt and shame and rehabilitation takes a completely different route, because East Germany is run by communists. Some of them had been in concentration camps themselves. They see themselves as they were victims of the Nazis, and they see themselves as the historical winners. So in their understanding, the communist resistance, together with the Red Army, overthrew this really bad fascist regime. So why should they be responsible for anything? They're not responsible. They were the victims themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They don't owe anyone anything except the Soviet Union with reparation payments. So Jews don't get any attention, or for that matter, any compensation from East Germany. So if you had been a German Jew who lived east of the Elbe in what then became the German Democratic Republic, the Socialist East, you had to wait till 1990 to get some compensation back, because East Germany just did not treat Jews as worthy victims. So in both societies, but for different reasons, you have a suppression or parceling out of the guilt question.
Mm-hmm. So was denazification a failure by whatever metric you want to apply to it, or did it actually achieve some of its goals?
Mm-hmm. Well, denazification has a really bad record. Most people many people point out that you have in West Germany, you have some former Nazis in positions of high office who are tolerated. You have in the 50s, in particular, you have both in East and West Germany amnesties and hardly any trials anymore. So from that perspective, it really failed. But if you look at the early years, so 1946 to 48, when Germany was occupied, actually the numbers are pretty impressive. So you have several 100,000 people in both the American zone and also the Soviet zone who spend considerable time in prison, who lose their right to work in their profession, who have to pay compensation payments and so forth. So for many people, immediately after the war, denazification is seen as a huge threat and big dent in their biographies. And I think it's important also to sort of remember, I mean, and sometimes even historians forget that, it's one thing to look back on this experience and know the outcome. But if you're caught up in 1946, 47, 48, you don't know. You don't know that denazification will come to an end.
Right.
So you have 2 years of your life which are lost. You don't know when that's going to end. And when you come out of denazification, many sort of mid-ranking Nazis don't find their footing back in society. So you have, cases where Nazi bigwigs end up being salesmen for cheap liqueur, and their wife has to work as a waitress in the local bar. And so for many people, this is a real step down and humiliating. Some of them even lose civic rights, I think you say, so the right to vote and things like that, and they're being now ignored. So denazification wasn't perfect by all means. There were many oversights, omissions, and mistakes, but it also needs to be remembered that most people who'd been through that experience now want to be left alone and in peace.
Yeah.
There are hardly any people who have any taste left for fascist or extremist politics. So they've learned to calm down, if you want.
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, the FRG, or and now Germany as a united country once again, post 1990, has been a stable, functioning democracy for what is it now, almost 80 years. So at the very least, like that, it worked to some degree where it's created a country that or helped create a country that is is a good neighbor and and stable and all that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, they could have done. I mean, what I
Sure.
just said, and what you say is right, but doesn't mean they couldn't have done more. So,
Right.
I mean, Adenauer had this famous quote when people say, "Look, you should just have former Nazi judges on your kind of on the payroll of your government." And not to speak of the Foreign Office and the intelligence services, which are overwhelmingly old Nazis in the 1950s. His response to that was, I mean, he came from Cologne, and so he sometimes liked to have these Cologne sayings. And he said, well, if the only water that you have is dirty water, you have to make do with dirty water. You don't throw out the only water that you have. That was sort of his line. If we look comparatively, at other European societies, there are many societies that I think Norway and the Netherlands, where collaborators were punished much more severely than in Germany. And they also became functioning democracies and strong economies. So, Adenauer, I mean, that was sort of a self-justifying aphorism he put down there. If he had wanted to, you could have rebuilt the economy and have put a few more Nazis in jail. That wouldn't have been a problem, I think.
Yeah. Plenty of Nazis to throw in jail. I mean, I know, punishment and in the immediate post-war decade, punishment and the quest for justice for the victims of the Third Reich wasn't as enthusiastic as probably anybody would like. German courts paid very little attention to the murder of Jews after the war, but that did eventually change. So how and why did that confrontation with the past begin to occur?
Yeah. No, very important question. I mean, the classic answer you still get is very short and simple, and it's 1968. So many people say, well, it's in 1968 with the student movement and the new social movements that a new generation of Germans confronted their parents and grandparents. And that's then established much greater awareness and remembrance of what at that point of time became known as the Holocaust. That's a bit too simple, really, and doesn't match the facts. And it's also very convenient because the people who maintain this story are mainly 68ers themselves. So they see themselves as the people who got Germany moving. on that front.
Right.
If you go back to the immediate post-war years, I mean, I was amazed in the research just how hotly debated memory culture, as we call it now, was. So you have, on the one hand, you have all sorts of veteran groups who want to insist that only Hitler, Himmler, and the SS were evil, but they in the regular army or even in the Waffen-SS were really good soldiers. So you have vocal veteran defense of what they see as a good war. But at the same time, you have youth groups. So mid-1950s already, you have the first sort of trips to concentration camps such as Bergen-Belsen. And these are, jazz sort of jazz orchestras who organize trips to pay their respect to the victims of Nazi crimes. You have, you have anti-Semitism, but at the same time, you have local schools volunteering to rebuild desecrated local Jewish cemeteries. You have anti-war films. You have the Anne Frank diary becoming the bestseller in West Germany and being put on stage. It shows on over 1,000 stages in the late 50s. So you have a lot going on. So it's not that the war and war crimes are sort of silenced and shut down, and then suddenly in 1968 people wake up to it. And the complication is also on the other end of the story, because after 1968 things die down again a little bit. So the big, probably the biggest single event that raises awareness and causes discussion and emotional involvement in the whole debate about what had happened exactly in the Second World War is the American TV series Holocaust, which is shown in 1979. Single TV program that attracted more telephone calls, readers or listeners' letters, public discussion than anything else. So it goes back and forth. So I think it's better to see it as a shift in the relative position of different voices than a kind of simple story of there was nothing and then there's finally is more. So there's much more going on in the 50s and 60s than many people recognize.
Mm-hmm. Bear with me here. You're going to have to hear my horrible pronunciation of German words. So the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, were there any value changes brought about by the Wirtschaftswunder?
No, the economic miracle is not bad. Your pronunciation. You're just missing one S. It's the Wirtschaftswunder.
Wirtschaftswunder. Sorry.
All right. Yeah. It's all right.
German. I can never get a handle on it.
That was. I mean, it was quite good. It was quite good. No, the economic miracle is really important for both at the time, but also since that time. So at the time, the economic miracle allows you to integrate these 12 million expellees I had previously mentioned. That's hugely important because in the late 40s and early 1950s, it's not clear how these millions will fit in to a new democracy.
I just sorry to interrupt. I was just say, but I mean, 12. I mean, just in the abstract, 12 million people is a lot of people. But So what is the actual population of
Yeah.
Germany when it's trying to
Yeah, sure.
incorporate?
So we're talking about 20% of the population.
Hmm.
So every fifth person is from an expellee family. So they arrive, some of them have a few possessions, but basically they arrive without assets, without capital, other than the few possessions they have and the skills they have. And they distributed mainly in the areas where they arrive, and for simple geographic reasons, that is the rural north and the rural south. Now, in these rural areas, there isn't much work for them either. So it's from a material point of view, it's a very difficult situation, but it's also a difficult situation politically, because there is considerable debate among these expellees what the future will or should look like. So some people talk about revenge. They think, okay, the war was lost, but we're going to reclaim our homeland, which means challenging the new borders agreed by the Allies after 45. So you have a very large potential group that's threatening to domestic stability and international stability.
Hmm.
And the economic miracle is really vital for their integration. They're discriminated against. Like most refugees, I mean, many people don't care that they're ethnic Germans. They think they're just as strange and alien as people from Poland or Czechs or other people. So they discriminate them and treat them very badly. The economic miracle gives them a leg up, and is hugely important for I think, their own identity and sort of pride in accomplishing something and restarting their life. But it's also important for their status in society. Suddenly, they're important because they provide important manpower in the economic miracle. And the importance of that you can see in the growing acceptance of the democratic federal republic. So in the early 50s, significant numbers thought the best year, when they're asked, what do you think are the best years you and Germany have had? Very few think the present. Many more think the so-called peace years under Hitler, so 1933 to 39, and others think under the emperor before the First World War.
Hmm.
By the late 50s, so once the economic miracle is going, the sympathy with the Hitler years has completely gone down, and most people have, made democracy their new home. So it's really, really important, that growth period, for absorbing potential social conflict. But the economic miracle is also quite important in the long run, because even now, most Germans, in the back of their mind, I mean, if you're from West Germany, and as the German economy currently is in recession, now third year sort of stagnating, the economic miracle is the kind of reference point which people have in the back of their head. This is how things should be. Of course, as we
Same
know,
here in the United States too.
yeah,
I mean, it's
yeah,
people sort of have rose-colored glasses for the economy of the the
yeah.
1950s and early 1960s, which is never going to return. I mean, but just based on
No. But it's
yeah.
interesting how this
Mhm.
this relatively, I mean, historically speaking, this was a short period and a completely exceptional period in
Mhm.
history, but it's become the sort of yardstick.
Yeah.
Um, so so the economic miracle is also, so I said, economic miracle, it has these positive effects, but in the long term, actually, it has some negative effects, because it means people are having expectations which are completely unrealistic now.
Mm-hmm. You brought it up a little bit. Are there any revanchist feelings about the borders to the east, about East Prussia? Is there bubbling under the surface of German society? Is there a lot of? I mean, is that just basically at this point a fait accompli, and that's not really something anyone really thinks about, or is there still some sort of longing for the restoration of the the pre-1930 pre-World War II borders of Germany?
Well, you had in the 1950s, you had organized parties for the different ethnic, the Sudeten, the people from the Sudetenland, and the Silesians, and also the East Prussians. And they, for a brief period, they were in parliament, and they were one of the coalition partners, Adenauer. But with the economic miracle, that then dies down, and so these parties go downhill. The sort of cultural associations of the East Prussians and Silesians, they keep going, and when Willy Brandt commits to détente and signs the so-called sort of Eastern treaties with Poland and with the Soviet Union, recognizing the borders, there's an outcry. People think this is a betrayal, and fair enough, one should add, both Brandt and Christian Democrats had always addressed, these are hundreds of thousands of people coming to conferences and being addressed by politicians. And the politicians has always told them, look, we'll never give up those territories. And then in 69, 70, you sign these treaties recognizing the borders. So there's some pushback and some irritation, but ultimately, revanchism doesn't have a big political movement to support it. So there's some right-wing extremist groups still dream of taking those lands back, but they're marginal groups. And the people, the majority of the people who had lost their homelands, they there's sort of studies charting how they accommodate themselves with the situation, and it sort of breaks down really into three equal parts. So by the 1980s, 1/3 thinks of West Germany as their new homeland. That's their homeland. You have another third who thinks in terms of like a bit like a dual citizenship. They think, I belong to West Germany, but somehow deep down, my old Eastern homeland still matters. And then you have 1/3 who really just nostalgic, but they're not a political force. So this is an emotional attachment, which they find difficult to let go, which is understandable, but it has there's no big political movement. And I don't think now, I don't think any of the parties, even the most extreme right, which a footnote, the co-chair of the populist Alternative for Germany, her father was one of the expellees, and apparently never got over that. So she talks about that, but she doesn't say, hey, let's take back Poland or so.
Right. Speaking of the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, or the Alternative for Germany, for Americans who might not, who probably don't follow German politics very closely, I'm sure most Americans don't, what to make of the AfD? I mean, because they're branded a far right party, but that seems to be, when it comes to be the European sort of center left consensus, that sort of everybody gets labeled. If they're slightly right of center, they seem to be labeled a far right party. So what do we make of the AfD? Is it an actual far right party? Is it is it a threat to German democracy? I mean, it just came in. I mean, the party itself just came in second, right, in the latest parliament. Significant. The
No,
second. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, what you just said is interesting. I mean, you said, well, basically you said compared to what? Aren't there also similar developments in other European countries? So how special are they?
Right, I mean, I'm just like in America, I'm just saying like they're almost kind of painted as like a crypto Nazi, or like just.
Well, they got 20% nationwide in the election on the 23rd of February, so a few weeks ago. So 20% across the whole country, but in the eastern regions, they got 38%. And in some cities and some towns in the east, they got 48%. So they're and the first point to make is that they're now really established. It's not some small splinter group or so. They're there, and I think they're there to stay. The other thing is what you said. Well, let's put this a little bit in European context. How extreme are they? There was an Austrian. The Austrians have their own populist party, which is very big, and there was a joke. There was a joke in Austria saying, after the German election, and the Austrians said, what you call a move to the far right in Germany, we call a move to the left, because 20% isn't that high. It's much worse in Austria. So the AfD, who are they? Who are they? And what do they represent? Well, the AfD started not that long ago. I mean, compared to other European populist parties, it only started 10 years ago or so as a sort of professional middle class circle of professors and economists and journalists who were skeptical of Angela Merkel's policies in the euro crisis and the financial crisis in the European Union. So it really had an economic focus and was making the demand that policies shouldn't be moved up to the European level, but monetary policy, the currency should be a national issue. So get rid of the euro, reintroduce the Deutschmark, and have the Bundesbank, the central bank, in control, and not Brussels. So it was an anti-European Union move. And then in the next few years, these professors and some of them economic liberals, you may want to call them, got booted out, and more right-wing populist leaders took over and made the party a mass movement. And since then, it's moved further to the right. What does that mean, further to the right? You have some leaders in the eastern part of the country who've been officially defined by the intelligence services and constitutional court as having right-wing extremist leanings or beliefs. Why? Because some of them want to, some of them in their proposals, particularly when dealing with migration, would break the constitutional rights as defined in the basic law. So equality, respect for citizenship and human rights. Some of the statements they made would be a breach of those, and so they've been labeled like that. So those are people in the East. In the West, I would say you have fewer of those right-wing extremists. I mean, there I would more classify them as sort of populists, sort of comparable to populists in France or in Britain or in Italy. So you have a mix, you have a real mix of people, and what unites them is that they are anti-establishment. So what they all believe in is that the parliament is controlled by political lobbies, and the old parties, the established parties, are using parliamentary democracy to enrich themselves or to help their constituencies. So they want more plebiscites, things like that. They're anti-European Union, so they want out of the European Union. And they have a very strong stand on the migration issue. So some positions, so basically you have a spectrum. You have a spectrum of views that go from, let's call it sort of hard conservatism, but on the other end of the spectrum, you have some you have some Nazi fringes there, and constant legal conflicts over people who've also been members of neo-Nazi parties, or who are giving speeches which are in defiance of the Constitution, things like that.
Right.
Now, what about the voters? So I've talked about the people running the party, but ultimately they matter because they have voters. And there are two things which are interesting about the Alternative for Germany. One is that they've won over a lot of voters who used to vote Christian Democrats or conservative people, who felt abandoned by Merkel. So Merkel moves the Christian Democrats to the center of the political spectrum and leaves behind at the fringes these conservative voters who don't agree with her migration policy in particular, who no longer have a political home. And the Alternative for Germany sort of sucks them up. So that's one important group. The other important group is non-voters. So it's absolutely staggering. I mean, I've looked at the data in the recent elections. The AfD, which used to be a small party, manages to attract more non-voters. So in the last election, the federal election, they attracted as many non-voters as all the other parties together. So that's I think a sign of how alienated a sizable pool of voters feel. And then the third group, which is important, is the East. So the AfD has made progress in the West, but there's a clear disproportionate relationship between West support in the West and support in the East. So,
and when we say East, we mean like the old borders of inside the old borders of the GDR.
That's right. That's right. So Saxony and Thuringia and Brandenburg and Mecklenburg, those areas, where they on average get 38-39%, which is extraordinary. I mean, far more than any other party. So, and the reason there is, this polarization between the former East and the former West, and how even now, after 35 years after reunification, you have growing, not lessening, but growing alienation. Many Easterners feel ignored, discriminated against, and the Alternative for Germany is kind of their Eastern identity party. And their slogan in the election was, "The East is rising." So it gives people the sense of, you vote for us, we give you back your pride.
Mm-hmm. Do you have time? I know we've gone over an hour already, and that was about as long as I wanted to keep you. But do you have time to just answer a couple more questions? Just
a couple more.
Sure. Yeah. So you've been touching on the migrant issue. How much of the migrant issue is driving, or how much of German politics is being driven by the migrant issue currently?
Most of it.
Most of it.
Most of it. I mean, well, I mean, the election has happened. So there are coalition talks between the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. And they seem to have come to certain agreement that suits both sides about how to deal with the migration issue. But in the run-up to the election, sometimes you wouldn't know that there is an international security crisis. Sometimes you wouldn't even know that Germany is in economic crisis because the migration issue had completely taken over. I mean, quite in many ways disproportionate, because actually migration, the numbers of migrants had actually been falling. So there had been a steady fall, but it had been accompanied by some, brutal terror attacks. So migration received a lot of attention. The Alternative for Germany was pushing this issue, made it their own issue, and it was then really becoming center stage when Merz, the person likely to be the next chancellor, Christian Democrat, made it sort of his issue, basically saying, I mean, his idea at that point was that you can't ignore the issue. If you want to contain the populists, you need to make migration your own issue. That didn't really work. I mean, he actually lost some votes. I mean, it didn't make a dent in the populists at all. And what it did, it sort of reinforced the the sense of the populists. Look, we've been telling you this all this time, so we're right. You've been taking far too long to wake up to this. So the AfD, in a way, won the battle for public discourse and public attention, because they actually did get to make the migration issue the central issue in politics.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know, like you said, this is the migrant issue being the central issue, but you write in the book that it's over the subject of war and peace more than any other subject, where you can see the German, the changing conscience of Germany, or of the German people. So what has been the impact on Germany, on German politics, of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? And, what is the price, the price of Germany's post international restraint, especially, post end of the Cold War and post unification?
Well, it's a very concrete price, and I'll just give you one example for that point. Is that the initial reaction of the Federal Republic to the Russian attack on Ukraine was for the Chancellor Scholz then to say, well, we're now in a new era. We need to completely turn things around. And he found a special fund for the army. But when it came to support for Ukraine itself, they dithered for a long time. So initially it was sort of helmets rather than tanks. It took a very long time for Germany to commit more serious weapons to it. And the reason for that was that Scholz was really walking a tightrope, because public opinion was deeply divided. So you had, on the one hand, sort of half the population think, oh, we must do anything in our power to support Ukraine and defend their sovereignty. But the other half was convinced, no, you should always look for reconciliation with Russia. And sending weapons would be the very opposite signal you should be sending. So no weapons. So he slowed things down, Scholz. In the end, they sent, I think, 12 battle tanks. one reason why the number was so small is that after 1990, they shrunk down the army very
They don't have any
significantly.
tanks. That's the problem.
Yeah. So Germany used to have, when the Berlin Wall came down,
thousands of tanks.
West Germany had something like 4,000 tanks, and East Germany had another 2,000. Today, I think they have 300. So this is a very serious difference. And then they sent the 12 tanks to Ukraine, and of course, tanks, like anything else, particularly in wartime, things fall off, or they get hit and they need to be repaired. So within months, hardly any of these 12 tanks was still rolling because there were no repair parts. So the German army is in a very, very dire straits. But the population is divided. And again, there's also an interesting west-east divide. So sending weapons to Ukraine has far more support in the western part of the country than in the eastern part of the country. In the eastern part, even not just populists, but also Christian Democrats want to reopen relations with Russia. They want Russian gas to flow again across the Baltic. They want the war to end by whatever means, whereas the people in the West are more inclined to give support to Ukraine. So the internal divisions of the country also play themselves out on the international stage. So it needs to be seen. I mean, Merz has been very outspoken and persuaded his party to boost defense by unprecedented amounts, but needs to be seen whether he can take the whole country with him, because there's a great deal of suspicion.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, there was a ton of other stuff I would have loved to talk to you about, but like I said, I've already kept you long, so my apologies. I'll just end it, with the normal exit question everybody on the show gets, and that is, what would you like the audience to get out of this book, or what's the one thing you'd want a reader to take away from it, having read it?
Well, I think the main thing I would like readers to get out of it is that this longer historical perspective really helps you to understand why Germany is so conflicted and divided now. You can't understand it by just looking at the present situation. The divisions we've been talking about in the podcast, they have historical roots. And so understanding how these roots got formed is really vital if you want to make sense of the way Germany is now and its place in the world.
All right, very good. Once again, the name of the book is Out of the Darkness, The Germans 1942 to 2022. Fantastic book. I have a lot of Germans on here. I don't know if that's my predilection or if it's just there just are more Germans writing books than other nations, but I've had quite a few Germans on the podcast and done quite a few books on Germany and German history. And I'd have to say this book is it's truly, truly fantastic. It's such a thorough look at this period and, where Germany was and where Germany is going and how Germany got to this point. And as Dr. Trentmann writes in the book, after decades of knowing what they are against, Germans need to figure out what they are for heading into the future. And but it's highly, highly recommended. Just look at this last 80 years of German cultural history, political history, and what it means to be German in the 21st century, what it meant to be German after the fall of the Third Reich, all those sorts of things. And you must have spent. You said you started the book in 2015, so and it was published in 2023, I think, in Europe at least. It wasn't until 2024 over here, but 8 years is a significant chunk of your life, and I'm sure a lot of that was spent in archives, and digging through letters and newspapers and manuscripts and all sorts of things. So ton of work went into this. So once again, just can't recommend it enough. The name of the book, Out of the Darkness, The Germans, 1942 to 2022. The author, Dr. Frank Trentmann. And Dr. Trentmann, thank you so much for coming on the podcast to discuss the book with us. And like I said earlier, thank you so much for taking the, massive amount of time out of your life to, get the book put together and get the sucker published so we could all enjoy the fruits of your labor.
Thank you for the good questions. Good to talk to you.
Oh, no problem. And again, if you like this podcast, please consider leaving us a 5-star review and sharing with your friends. And if you have any questions or comments or any suggestions for books you'd like to see discussed on the podcast, you can always reach out to me at tbenson@heartland.org. That's tbenson@heartland.org. And for more information about the Heartland Institute, you can just go to heartland.org. And we do have our Twitter X account, whatever you want to call it, for the podcast. You can reach out to us there too. It's under @illbooks, @ILL books. So make sure you check that out. And that's pretty much it. So thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you guys next time. Take care. Love you, Robbie. Love you, Mom. Bye-bye.